Hello, everyone. My name is Anthem Salgado, business coach, founder of Art of Hustle, which serves self-employed and small businesses and has done so for the past 9 years, particularly in marketing, business development, and to a large degree also personal development. It's ranked #1 for the category of marketing in San Francisco, and we have been constantly producing all kinds of content from educational to informative to inspiring, and I think today's contribution to that content making will intersect in all of those fields. We are speaking with Claudine del Rosario. Welcome. She is a single mother of 2 boys, 16 and 5. She has been working at the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing for the last 13 years to stabilize the South of Market neighborhood in the face of rapid development and gentrification through government grants. For the last 15 years, she has been teaching at the University of San Francisco as an adjunct professor in the Yuchengco Philippine Studies Program. She also has a fledgling business, WYYYLD, intended to maximize women's wellness. She believes that if all women, particularly women of color, are able to inhabit their power and innate wisdom, the world would be transformed for the better. Claudine's mission is to disrupt and decolonize the matrix within herself, her relations, and the world. Welcome.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm so honored.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to have this conversation with you and to share it with the world. I think that last statement about disrupting and decolonizing the matrix within yourself, your relations, and the world is a bold statement. I think that we need bold statements like that. What does it mean to you to disrupt and to decolonize?
So The Matrix is probably my favorite movie of all time. And The Matrix, I think we ingest it every day. So just to give an example, and it's disrupt and decolonize because I want to actually name that it's a process of colonization that for me, particularly as somebody of Philippine descent, right, and a people that's been colonized many times, that was part of the experience. And it's not just people who are colonized, but everyone who buys into that ideology, which is like I said, everywhere, that thought process needs to be disrupted. So just to give an example, I was thinking about this, like where does that even come from? When I was a kid, like as a young girl growing up in New Jersey, I wanted to be white. And I admitted that to some of my students, like not too long ago. I was like, I wanted to be a white girl. And it's funny to say that now, right? Because I'm so immersed in cultural work, and I don't think people who know me well would say, really. But that's what I was surrounded by. That's what you saw on TV. That's who I grew up around. I didn't really see anybody who looked like me. People would ask me, where is the Philippines? What is that even? And it's not just those basic things. It's really like even working in government is such a colonial system, and we don't speak about it. So we get all of these ideas, like from what it is to be ladylike. What is a woman? What is her role in society? What does it mean to be successful, for example? All of these different definitions come from colonized concepts, and that is what I want to disrupt in everything, in my work, in my personal relationships. And I think it really does start within myself. And every day I find ways like, oh, there's another way.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring this closer, just to make sure we get good volume.
Yeah.
So how does that translate? Can you give an example of how that concept of disrupting and decolonizing might translate in parts of your work or parts of your personal life?
So here's a kind of a personal example that came up recently. I have a son, he's 16, and when he was born, we decided purposefully to hyphenate his name, right? And so, like, I think we go about the world thinking like, oh, well, children are named, they take on their father's surnames, right? And I was just thinking about this today, like one small way of doing that was that we hyphenate. So he has both his father's and my name in his surname, and it's a lot to say. It doesn't.
It's a lot of letters.
It doesn't fit very neatly on a baseball jersey, but so it has come up. Like sometimes, like for example, on his varsity jacket, he chose one name, and it really upset me. I was like, "That's not your name. It's not complete. You're gonna have to get rid of that one and go back and get both names on there." But even that, like, that's just one level. So even both names, like if you were to look at both names, they're both colonized names.
Right.
You know, and how do we go back? And I want to honor my lineage. I want him to honor his father's lineage.
Right.
But that's one way that it comes up, and I just, you know, at least start to question. And through his name, we force him to question as well. Right. And then here in my work, I think an easier one is in teaching because of that experience that I had growing up, and who knew that I would be able to find a job and a way to make money teaching Philippine studies, and I get a bunch of Filipino students and non-Filipino students every year, and I get to have conversations with them where I ask them to question these things that are maybe they've never questioned until they came to college.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just the very act of shining a light on something and wondering, like, why is that so?
Yes.
And does it have to be?
Yes.
Right? And what else could it be is in itself its own sort of like, I mean, definitely very powerful process. Also terrifying.
Yes.
For folks who might not have done that work or might not have a familiarity with that work, you know. How do people ease into it? I mean, you described that your experience as a young person growing up in Jersey is much different than your experience now as an adult, better informed, you know, more confident. So how does one start that series of questions in a way that, I don't know, might be safe for them, might help them dip their toes in the water so that their whole world doesn't get rocked overnight?
You know, I'm wondering if you think that their world gets rocked with those conversations now overnight, because I've been teaching for probably over 15 years now, and I've noticed that, like, when I first started, I would say things like, we're going to challenge white supremacy, we're going to challenge patriarchy. I would turn around and kind of be like, cringy, like, is it okay?
Are they following still?
Right, because it's not, I teach at USF, right? It's not SF State, it's like, it's very different. There's some, you know, conservative,
right.
Like very religious, traditional, you'll see students who come from those kind of families, which is kind of the family that I came from. And, but now today, when I say those things, nobody even blinks.
Yeah.
It's part of the conversation. So I think that there has been a cultural shift in the time that I've been doing this work.
Yeah.
And it seems a little bit like 15 years ago when I started, it was a scarier conversation to have, and now it seems like, you know, there are some little bits and pieces of counter-hegemonic projects going on that can get ingested by people, because it feels different to be talking about those things now.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that.
Yeah.
That overall there is a shift.
Yeah.
I guess it would just, I guess it would be different on a one-to-one basis, right? Like some people aren't ready. Some people aren't ready. And I think about that mostly when I think about disrupting and decolonizing food. Because I'm really into, not like I'm a spokesperson for this subject at all. It's just like my personal quest to decolonize food, because there's just been so much bad food that's been passed on as culture. And I'm at an age, literally, I don't mean to say that in any other like symbolic way, like literally I'm at an age where I'm seeing people that I've grown up with get sick. And it strikes me as unacceptable, because the solution oftentimes is very simple on paper, but the conversation is very difficult, because to decolonize food is a very touchy subject. Just to be able to say that stuff is going to kill you. So people aren't ready for it. And I find that when people aren't ready for it, in my experience, my conversations that I've had with certain folks, if I don't ease into it, they tend to wall up very quickly.
Yeah.
And when they do, I'm doing them more of a disservice. Because now they're more likely to stick to a plan that is going to continue to kill them rather than not. So like, I feel like it depends on the subject, a person's readiness, and how close to home it is, I guess.
Totally. So, I mean, I have so many thoughts about that.
So many.
Yeah, like, and I think a lot of it is relationship building too. Like, you know, you meet somebody and they say something that you might not ideologically agree with. That might not be the moment to say it, is when you've just met them, right?
Right, of course.
And I have like kind of learned that. I mean, and I would say that that probably is one of the things that's helped me become successful in my role is the relationship building and being able to ease into the conversations at the right time. Maybe we'll talk about that later.
Yeah,
but I'm just
yeah.
curious about like your thoughts, speaking of decolonizing food, right? Are you talking specifically about Filipino food? And do you have any thoughts about like our particular food and the people often say, oh yeah, it's not healthy. Like, oh, let's get Filipino food, it's so good, but you know it's not healthy. You have thoughts about that?
I would totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. I don't think it has to be the case forever. I think there are certain mild switches we can make to certain dishes and recipes that would help us steer it back on course. I think, but you know, you're probably more expert on this subject than I am, but I'm just gonna riff on this. But it's like, if you think about, from my understanding of Filipino food, as a colonized people, we weren't getting the best food. We weren't allowed to have the best food. And so really what you're looking at, I mean, literally is a colonized food choice, right? And so eventually, you know, you take pride in something, even if it's very little, like taking pride in a neighborhood, even if it's not like the best neighborhood, like eventually we learn to adopt it and to love it. And so that's probably where things get difficult, is that sense of like, well, this is our food.
Yeah.
Right? And even after decolonization, like literal decolonization, like we still stick to that food. I guess that's what colonized mentality is, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been watching these documentaries, right? The simple choices with food is just like eat fresh, more produce. Just like something as simple as that, and we just, fresh and produce don't appear very often in our dishes.
I think the ones that are more, not that there is a mainstream, but the mainstream Filipino, like everybody loves, like if you don't know anything about Filipino food, you do know lumpia, right? Which is like deep fried and it's pork.
Yeah.
But like when I think like when you did the tribal tour, right? Where I don't know where you went, but I mean we definitely got exposed when we went to like Mindanao and went deeper into like rural areas. Like their food, some places didn't have access to fresh food, but when you go to certain places like on the mountains, they're actually like planting their own food.
That's right.
And there's like camote, for example, like, and it has so many different ways to get nutrients.
Right.
So I think that there are ways even within that.
I agree.
And there are people doing the work around here who are like brilliantly finding the ways to just kind of shift it and look at our food in a different way, and you know, like No Worries Catering, making it vegan, or Angela Angel is looking at like our herbs and the medicinal values of some of the herbs that are indigenous to the Philippines. And so I think it's there. There's just like the lifting the layers of the colonization off of it, and what was there before actually is pretty rich. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. It's like time traveling.
Totally.
Yes, I agree with that. Let's talk about teaching.
Okay.
I mean, university system is broken up typically into semesters, which is like, it's a lot of time, but it's not a lot of time to spend with a young person. So what could you hope in that span of time, whether it's just one class or whether it's a student you see over several semesters in the course of their college career, what could you hope to impart or, give them? Or what, obviously there's the curriculum, there are things that the university expects of you, but what are your personal goals as an educator, I guess?
It's relationship building.
Yeah.
So, I teach a number of different classes, and one of them has become really a big part of my practice of community work, and it's it's a service learning class. I actually get a lot of non-Filipino students in that class. And the Filipino ones, I still get a handful of them, and what I hope is, and it's happened, it's not even just a hope, it continues to happen as the years go by. Like, students will come around and they'll get exposed. If they have to do service learning, I'll plug them into the work that I do at the city.
Nice.
So if they have to do 20 hours of work, I'll say, hey, here's Songcan, and hey, here's UP, here's come and work at the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. We need an intern for the semester.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is these people, and not just through me, I think just by living in San Francisco and having the interest, if they took my class, they have an interest in this stuff to begin with. And so they, that's part of my practice, is introducing them and making connections with them. Like, I think one of my students works for you now, right?
Yes, interned with me for a bit, yep.
Yeah, and so she's just one example. There's Caroline Calderon. She helped build one of the nonprofits that was seeded through the Soma Fund. And so there's like these full circle, like these relationships that I meet maybe at USF, but then I continue to work with them here at the mayor's office, and then through for a long time after, I stay in touch with them. And the best is when I get an email or somebody slides into my DMs and says, hey, that oral history project that I worked on last year I'm really glad you made me do that, because so-and-so may have passed away, like their grandmother may have passed away, or maybe they moved away, and I'm so glad I was able to document this part of her life.
Yeah.
That's the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also just getting to work with them beyond their years at USF. There are a lot of students that I still stay in touch with and that are doing the work, and that I get to watch them evolve.
Yeah, grow into their own leaders.
And stay connected to community.
Right.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It is really awesome, and that's it kind of was when I started my job here, because I'm in government, so to a lot of people I'm like working for the man now, which I am in a lot of ways, but that having that connection to the students and having that human interaction and getting to contribute in that way, really was something that during the times where I felt disconnected from community here at the mayor's office, that gave me life. Yeah.
That's wonderful to be able to build those bridges.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I was going to ask you is, there's so many expressions and so many ways to contribute to affect positive change. So, there's direct action, there is teaching, which you do, and there's how we contribute in our personal lives, in our neighborhoods, in our own households, and then there's policy, right? So I think it's kind of cool that several of those in your work and in the things you're passionate about connect directly, you know what I mean? But let's talk about the policy stuff, because I think that's interesting that you framed it as people think you're working for the man.
Yeah.
And you are, right?
Totally.
And you admittedly. But what can you share about the importance of policy and how it impacts, how it changes a city, especially now with this rapidly changing city, how much policy impacts what this city will eventually become, its identity?
I think it's so important. And for me, when policy is made, I think more important, policy shapes the way, we just had a plan get passed by the Board of Supervisors, the Central Soma Plan. And that means that all of these buildings, like they were upzoned, we're gonna have, when you go through Central Soma in a few years, it's gonna look, again, completely different. I know we're already experiencing that.
That's
every
right.
day we're going by these buildings like, hey, that wasn't there yesterday, and all of a sudden there's this thing there.
Right.
But, you know, those policies get made here. And along with, I guess, part of my mission in terms of transforming the world, I think one way of decolonizing that process is to engage in very authentic community engagement, where you really do genuinely go to the community and have a partnership in how the city develops. I think we have a history, again, a colonial system of like the government knows better, and we're the experts, and we are the technicians, so we know the best way to do this with the wind and the shadow, and it's the people who are living there, and so it takes longer to do authentic community engagement. It takes a lot longer, and the government already, everybody knows we notoriously move really slowly. But to do it right, it does take that engagement with the stakeholders, and to me that's the most important piece of policymaking, is to ensure that we are really engaging with the people who it's going to affect the most.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what you're, like, we don't ever talk about this stuff, so I mean, I don't know how long you've been living in San Francisco, but what is your observation of, or your sense of how the city has changed, and are we on the right track, or what
That's a big
see?
question. I've been living here since '93.
Okay.
I feel like the city has changed a lot, but what's interesting is I was a kid virtually when I moved here, so I've changed a lot too. And I feel like we both changed, not always together, right? There have been times where in the city and I had a really good relationship, and then we would part and kind of like be mad at each other and then come back together, depending on where I was in my personal life and my career and everything, you know?
Yeah.
I think, you know, there's a Gil Scott-Heron quote that I like to refer to from time to time, of the great poet and jazz singer. And he says in one of his songs, I'm gonna mess up the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of like, it's better to direct the change than simply go through the change. And so when I think about government and policy, these things I'm more learning about just in very recent years, right? Because I had some of the same ideas that you sort of expressed earlier, that there was a division between authentic work and the man's work, you know? And now I'm starting to see, you know, whenever I've been in a room of people who had a complaint about government or about, you know, agencies and things like this, not listening, it's always been this sense of like, well, we're not at the table, how come no one's inviting us to the table? And it gives me a new sense of appreciation when people like you are on the other side to help invite people to the table, because that is the number one complaint, that people are not being heard, and that they don't have a seat. And so I feel like, again, going back to something I mentioned earlier, there has to be a place for people to affect change wherever they are. And some people have certain skills on the ground, and some people can navigate this very complex system like you can, or know how to, and again, invite people to the table. It's very powerful. No one person's work is more valuable than the other person's. And so I feel like there's no sense for us to compete in that sense. Like, let's just all have similar values and ideals and move forward together and build those bridges where we can. You know, some people are better artists, some people are better policymakers, some people know how to navigate a grant system, and some people know how to write a poem. Like, it's all good, you know what I mean? Like, let's do it together. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, we all have our role to play.
Yeah.
And I feel like my role has been to be kind of the bridge between, you know, everybody within the city. I don't think it's a big secret, but people hated my project when it first started. They were like, it's extortion, you're asking for these developers to contribute to these things, like, what difference is it gonna make? But over the years, I think I've been able to help with the help of the CAC and being held accountable by the community, right? That a process where people really do feel like what they say has an impact.
Yes.
And I am a believer in that development. We can't stop the development from happening, right? It's happening.
That's right.
And change is inevitable, right? That's one of the things that we know is a constant in life. And I do believe that it's possible to have that change happen with everyone being able to benefit. And that I feel like is my role in this really small geography in the south of Market where, I think it's an incredibly dynamic neighborhood where that's where all the .coms want to be, all the tech companies wanted to be there, and it just so happened to be the place where a lot of immigrant families were living in the alleyways and nobody wanted to live there before. So that kind of conflict has, it's been a place where we could really have these experiments. Okay, now we've got these resources, and how can we really do something to make sure that the people who have been living there all this time can see some of the fruit of all of this, like the windfall and and we definitely aren't there yet. We don't have all the answers, but we've created a process where people feel like they've been able to participate.
Which is powerful.
Yeah, it's so important.
San Francisco has always been a sort of an experiment. Probably all of the West Coast, but definitely San Francisco. Since its earliest days. And I feel like what we see now is even more so a continuation of that experiment.
Yeah.
Like, no one's fully figured it out, and things just continue to keep changing, right? So it is interesting. I have heard somebody else say previously that San Francisco is positioned in this interesting way, which you just described, which is we have sort of like these ideas, these communities, these cultural values, and we're, not me necessarily, but we as a city are pretty moneyed, right?
Yeah.
So there's an interesting opportunity if there can be some kind of crossover to see how we can tap those funds to express some of these sort of like ideals that we have as a city culturally and community-wise. So again, a continuation of that experiment.
Yeah, we're seeing that.
Yeah.
We're seeing it with the creation of cultural districts and the resources that are going towards that to see what we can create. I think it's really interesting work that's happening now. And speaking of cultural districts, I think that Somos Filipinas, the Filipino Cultural District, which we invested in, more than 10 years ago and is like more than 20 years in the making, really,
Yes.
Is kind of at the forefront of that work.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kind of piloting a lot of these ideas, not just as a cultural district, but as a strategy to prevent displacement
Yes.
of communities and these and their assets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed. What can you tell folks who don't have a familiarity, or maybe they're new to the city and they need to know, what is the significance of South of Market? You mentioned a little bit earlier about obviously Filipinos and immigrant and families, but I guess digging a little bit further back into the actual history and the makeup of South of Market and its initial identity before this technology boom.
Well, even before that, like if we're sticking to some of the theme of like Filipinos, one of the reasons why I ended up taking this job, and I think that it landed in my lap in some ways. That more than 20, maybe 25 years ago, I watched this film called The Fall of the I Hotel, where if you've watched it, I still cry. I should tell my students I still cry today when I see it. But it was about like the mistakes that the city made, like with redevelopment, and we made those mistakes in the film war too, and just displaced these communities of color in the name of development and progress. And so it started even before South of Market was a thing for Filipinos. So we had Filipinos living at the I Hotel, and
What era, for context?
oh yeah, so the 60s, they came here as laborers mostly, and then they became elderly, and they were manongs, and we had like that hub on Kearney Street, and because we were having a time of expansion. They were all displaced. There was no plan for where they were going to go, and it was tragic. So then the new hub became the South of Market because it was like an industrial kind of zone, so lots of warehouses, and that nobody wanted to live there. It was considered unsafe, and you had a lot of Filipino families living there. I think it was over 600 families that were displaced when they built Yerba Buena. And so now you have Filipino families everywhere, but also there's a new hub like in the Excelsior. But we still had this concentration of Filipino serving organizations in the South of Market, and we're trying to preserve and learn from the lessons that we hopefully experienced back in the 70s, and not thinking about, it's not necessarily stopping the development. Like I said, we kind of know from experience we probably don't have the votes or the political will to stop it, and it's good for the city, right? Because that's what's generating the income. But how can we again have that development happen and ensure that people don't have to be wrongfully evicted? People can stay if they want to. They have the resources and they're able to thrive in these neighborhoods as much as possible by getting some of those resources that are being brought in. So now you have this neighborhood that you have like some of the wealthiest San Franciscans living right on top of some of the poorest residents of San Francisco. I mean, Soma is where we have a really high concentration of homeless people. And not just homeless like living in tents, but homeless like couch surfing and going to the school but are technically homeless.
Right, living in a car.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's important you bring that up, because for a long while I didn't know what homeless meant. And I guess the official definition is you just don't have your own permanent housing.
Yeah, it's really destabilizing.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of students are homeless.
A lot of kids, I was just going to say, a lot of kids at the public school are technically
And even at the college level.
Yeah.
So interesting times for the city, and yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I'm like, it's so sad, but I mean, there.
We have to do better.
Yeah, positively, on every level.
Yeah.
On every level. How did you get into this line of work? Because it's obviously very unique, and I think people are fortunate to have you. I mean, the people you work for are fortunate to have you. The people that you work with and that you serve are also fortunate to have you. So I think all around they're fortunate to have you. But it's also just like a very unique place to be. Like, how did you go from your work as an educator and community person to being inside of the machine?
I did a lot of nonprofit work, so again, it did kind of land on my lap in some ways. So I had not. When did I finish? I did my master's, like kind of later. It took me a little bit longer to get my master's done, and I was teaching and kind of doing some community development consulting prior to landing this job. And it was my friend Trina Villanueva who was working here, and she knew of the opening and knew that I had some relationships in the South of Market through my nonprofit work. And I think that, you know, people here kind of thought, oh, she'll have some street credibility with the folks there, which I thought I had too until the day I started.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What did you learn about that?
You know, that no matter what my relationships were, because of who I'm working for and whose interests I was kind of paid to protect.
That's right.
Yeah, that we're not on the same side. And I think that has been the work of my last few years, is that, yes, I work here and we have good intentions, and what we're, you know, discerning between intention and impact, right? It's not the same, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a very well-intentioned organization. Back then it wasn't the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. They were two separate organizations. And the Mayor's Office of Community Development did do some really good work, but still had to ultimately report to the mayor. And I just learned that, you know, there are divisions and there are lines and boundaries that do exist, and like that artful kind of navigation of where are our common goals, and how can I advocate for the community that I live in, that I work with, that at the time my kid was going to school in. How can I advocate within the machine for the benefit of that group with the insight that I bring to the table? So I feel like while on one end it meant that I was separated from community and in some ways isolated because I'm within the machine, and that was just part of it, and it's part of getting a steady paycheck and getting the mad benefits that you get working for the city. Those are all like huge privileges that I get working here, and so the isolation and the separation is part of that, comes with that. And how can I still advocate responsibly and push the envelope from within?
Yes. Yeah. Wow. There's probably a lot we can unpack there. But I think
could write several books.
Yes. But I feel like we've covered earlier, like, you know, the benefits of having you here. So even though you had that pushback and it sounds like it was difficult.
It's painful sometimes.
Especially when it comes to community, right? Because those are our folks. So sometimes you say, well, those are our people, and you want to be involved and participate and immerse, and then when it shifts, I feel like I had something similar happen to me.
Oh,
in a weird way.
Because I see it when it's happened to a number of people, like just when they go and work for different places, and I see it happening, and I'm like, I reach out, like, hey. Because
it's just a different paradigm. And I think it comes back down to the decolonizing of food, honestly.
That's so interesting.
If people aren't ready for it, then it can be very threatening. It can be very threatening to a person's identity and how they perceive the world, how they experience the world, the lens through which they've acclimated to experiencing and perceiving the world. And so, like, I feel like...
do you want to tell me about your experience?
Yeah, mine was not necessarily POC related, though it can be. There's definitely, like, overlap here and there. But I feel like for a long while, I had an identity as a creative person, as an artist. That was 15 years, completely immersed, completely committed to that ideology. I mean, I held it, and I threw down for it. I was all in, 100%. And then one day, when I felt like I had my heart broken by the arts industry, you know, I had to reinvent myself. I mean, and in my reinvention, I had to think, like, well, where did I go wrong in my own work, in my own career, and what could I have done better, and what do I wish I knew? And so that became the business that I have now, right? Like, these are all the things I had wished I had known. And when I looked around, I said to myself, well, who's providing these services? And at the time, and even now, very few, if any. So I said to myself, if it's not being provided and it's that important, I'll do it. I'll do the work. I'll reinvent. You know, I'll be that person. And I think for many years I pushed it, like, hey, artists, let's do this. Let's be more entrepreneurially minded. We need to get down. But I was also fighting against a big wave and a big machine in the sort of like arts institution that is in itself a teaching mechanism, right? A teaching force. And what they teach culturally is a handful of things that I could not fix because they were just polar opposites of the new paradigm I was trying to introduce. So simple things like artists get discovered. Don't worry about money, do good work, someone will notice you, you'll get picked up. That's taught from a very young age. And so I teach the exact opposite. Autonomy, agency, speak up for yourself. If you don't do it, no one's gonna do it. Very different. So it's hard for people to cross over, and eventually I feel like I lost a lot of people in that conversation. I don't think they hated me, but I think eventually they're like, man, that guy's crazy, right? And now I have a handful of artists that get it, but the many, many people that I wish I could have helped didn't follow along for the ride because they're like, well, that's not what we learned. And we're sticking to what we learned, which is do the good work, don't worry about money, don't worry about marketing, will be discovered. We'll be fine over here. And it's just, to me, kind of sad because historically that's never been true for any artist unless they were already starting with lots of privilege and advantage, right? Only the artist who started with a head start benefits from that narrative. People of color, historically marginalized communities, working class folks, that's not going to work for them.
Your lessons have stayed with me that during that time that I was consulting with you. Those lessons are really good. They're right on. And you know, artists, like somebody just said it the other day, because we're starting to invest in arts and culture, and there's this like artists get a bad rap, you know, for not being able to think about those things, right? And you know, you've seen as a funder, the city has to see that those things and those skills are in place to be able to manage finances and to be able to can't think of all the verbs that you just said, but basically the skills that you're describing that are very business-like skills that you don't necessarily associate with being an artist. They're actually part of the sustainability. Right. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was my own experience, feeling like a split from my old community. You know.
I'm glad you're doing the work.
I'm glad too. But I've had my own moments of loneliness in that, is what I'm saying. But I think hopefully,
I could see that.
As we all get older and as the age changes, not just my personal age, but like the era, you know, as people catch up. Again, like the food thing, hopefully people will catch on to the idea that like, hey, there's nothing wrong with autonomy. There's nothing wrong with having agency and speaking up for myself. In fact, I need to do this as part of my own decolonizing work or whatever. So I'm still hopeful that people will catch on.
I am too.
Whether it's if it's with me or somebody else to guide them. Let's talk about trauma-informed.
Oh, okay.
I've never heard of it until you mentioned it. And probably a lot of people.
It's new.
I like the concept. I feel like the concept is a familiar one, right? But the pairing of the words is new to me. So
people don't like the,
Yeah, how would you describe it, and what do people like or not like about it?
Well, I think there are a lot of folks who have responded to the term trauma-informed. And it basically, it comes from this mental health terminology and the curriculum that we're now talking about. It comes from DPH. It's like, you know, people who are serving in the health field and mental health in particular. The idea comes from this theory that, have you heard of ACEs?
No.
Adverse childhood experiences. So that if you have, like, there's a whole list. You can look it up online and you can take a test and see if you have experienced any of these ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. The idea is that if you've experienced,
I'm sure I have.
Most of us have.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea is that if you've experienced 4 or more, that your health is more likely to be negatively impacted in many different ways and experience all of these different challenges as an adult. They bring it back to your childhood trauma, right? And it was not connected to race originally at all, right? And I think what's interesting about the work that's being done on it now is that they're saying, well, experiencing racism in this country is another form of trauma. So there's like, I think it's called like the Philadelphia ACEs. They are making these connections between, you know, colonization and trauma and intergenerational trauma, and that actually this is trauma that our communities have experienced not just as children but for generations, through colonization, through slavery, through genocide here in this country, through colonial mentality and all these different ways, right? So again, the trauma-informed is connected to decolonizing. I'm not necessarily crazy about the word either, because when you bring it up and nobody's heard of it before, people are like, why do you want me to do that? There's nothing wrong with me. You know, and
that reminds me of the old stigma with therapy, though, right?
Yes.
When people would say, why do I need therapy?
Yeah.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, maybe it's not the most ideal. I know there are some groups that are saying, hey, can we shift the name, because this doesn't feel like asset-based, and we are really trying to embrace some of this, through that work, embrace some of the strengths that indigenous communities have and some of our own like cultural assets, if you will, that help us to survive the trauma of living in the matrix, right? And so I guess you might do a training with me at some point, right? Because this is what we're doing for some of our agencies now. We're really moving toward this model of making sure that everyone who's providing services to the public are trauma-informed. And that just means that we are taking care of ourselves, right? Because we understand and acknowledge that most people have experienced some form of trauma at some point in their lives, and that it informs how we interact with people. And so it's really just a compassionate, humanizing way of looking at our interactions with people rather than saying, what's wrong with that person? It's what happened to that person, and keeping that in the back of our heads as we dialogue.
Yeah, so it's another aspect of service-based work.
It's another aspect of service-based work, and I would say that it's also just another aspect of relationship, right? It really helps in like emotional intelligence and being able to manage even your own emotions, as well as the emotions of people who are around you. In a nutshell, that's what it is. Yeah.
And so because someone is trained or maybe a little bit more knowledgeable, trauma informed, that doesn't necessarily make them a mental health specialist, right? It just means maybe they have another dimension of empathy.
Yes, another dimension of empathy. And fundamentally, for me, I think it's an empathy that starts with yourself.
Yeah.
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 Empathy for the other person, but also a big part of it is like honoring your own experiences and your feelings.
Right. All work begins at home.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm down with that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Would that translate to on a wider scale to policy? I mean, you talked about it in terms of like making sure that service providers are knowledgeable of this framework, so as to put everybody on the same page. And obviously, like you said, it has roots in mental health, and now it might have applications to broader community or groups of people who may have experienced some level of trauma. How does that translate to like an even bigger picture, I guess, as you know, city or neighborhood or what have you?
We are really, I mean, maybe other departments are ahead of us, but this department is on the cusp of really diving into that. And this is why I've been doing this work for 15 years, but only in the last couple of years have I been able to really talk about race here in this department, race and equity. And there is now a citywide initiative to advance racial equity across all city departments, and we never really talked about it before. So, and that does impact policy. So it is a conversation that is happening to inform not just how we do the work in the community, like create policy. It's also about our practices with each other, so internal practices and policies, and it's kind of brand new terrain for us. And what our department in particular is doing is coupling trauma-informed care and trauma-informed practices with racial equity, because we see that there is a fundamental connection between those two things. So it's not just a mental health thing, or it is a mental health thing, and it is also a racial equity thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And very avant-garde, right? Like
You
very.
think so?
Well, because it doesn't typically. It doesn't feel like it is. It exists as I guess as an everyday thing as it should be. Like it's still a to me, especially on the policy side. Like that to me strikes me as radical, because regular people can't even have these conversations.
I love it.
Right?
I'm glad you think it's radical, because I love it.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, of course. And I think to most people, to like your everyday, people just aren't used to having those conversations within that context.
Right.
Yeah, we have them in other places.
Right.
Or we have them in our small little groups.
Yeah.
But then to be talking about it to a department of 100 people that reports to the mayor and is part of the machine is really
Powerful.
and exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
I had another thought. It's escaping me right now, though. It might come back to me later. I think the thing that I was coming to is like, yeah, I don't know. We'll leave it alone.
Okay.
We'll leave it alone.
Okay.
What else do I have here?
You want to talk about self-care?
Let's do it. I was heading that way. But it's a good springboard from the mental health thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would like to hear about, I think this is something that you and I are both passionate about.
Yes.
So I would love to hear about your own self-care practices. Because I think we could probably riff about this for a while.
It's for a long time. I think I'll just give you the high-level bullet points. I think for me, I think spiritual practice is really important. I don't necessarily mean religious.
Yeah.
I think I don't have a particular teacher or guide that I follow, although I don't think there's anything wrong with it if a person does. But I'm a big fan these days of Dharma talks, like on YouTube, because there are so many now.
Yeah.
And so there's a handful of people that I follow that I just love to hear them riff and talk about a particular topic. And a lot of it is just like understanding your own mind, because I feel like our minds tend to trick us, especially these days. What I'm learning about technology and its impact on the brain is more and more people are developing a lack of ability to focus, and not just kids, right? There's a sense of like, a lot of people think about short attention span and children, but the technology itself, the way it's been created, mobile technology specifically, is training us to constantly scroll. Right? There's a Facebook scrolling mechanism, there's an Instagram scrolling mechanism, there's a YouTube scrolling mechanism, and the idea is like, keep scrolling until you find something you like. And after that, scroll again to find something else you like. And so it's building the sense of short attention. And that's all mind stuff, right? And so if we let it escape us and not, as we talked about in the very beginning, learn to ask questions like, wait, why is that? Why am I this way? Why am I thinking this way? How does this technology impact me? How could it be altering my brain chemistry? Just to ask those kinds of questions, and what could I do to work against that? Those are the kinds of questions I like to ask. And so I find that like listening to certain talks on mindfulness practice really is one of the big answers. Like to get comfortable literally doing nothing, which so many people can't do, right? Like, can I sit for 3 minutes? If just that. And if I could do it for 3 minutes, can I do it for 5 minutes? Can I do it for, I did 18 minutes the other day. I was so proud of myself. It wasn't the best sitting, moment or practice, but it was a thing. Like I was like, hey, I did it.
Yeah.
I sat there, and that's what I needed. It's a good reset mechanism. But so that's the stillness part. For me, the other part, obviously, we talked about food knowledge, which I'm very obsessed about, because I think like, again, asking those questions, being inquisitive, like what's up with this body? How does it work?
Yes.
Like how did nature intend for it to work? Like there's got to be a way to not even hack into it. Like that's such a popular phrasing these days amongst dudes, especially. Like body hack, mind hack. You don't need to hack it. The body works pretty well if we just use it the way it was intended to work. Right? So for me, that's where the food thing comes in, like just making better choices around food. And then finally, action, right? Like jujitsu is like my other passion. I think for a long while, like I would read samurai books, like just to be curious. And there was always this emphasis on like imagining death. And I was always so curious, like to wonder, like how does one do that? Like commit to an idea of death and make peace with it. And I think the closest I've come so far, as a regular human, not a samurai, is in jujitsu. because it still is very martial in that respect. And were it not for the tap, which is a way to admit defeat,
Okay.
many of us who practice would have broken limbs or would have been strangled to death.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a weird way, it's like a literal meditation on death, you know? And so it's always like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Every time I lose in a sparring match or whatever, it's like a little death. And it's like, you know, it's an interesting thing.
That's dope.
You know, it's an interesting thing. So those are my self-care practices. What are yours?
I feel like damn near everything I do every day is a self-care practice. Like even this interview in a way is a self-care practice, because I had I realized that part of taking care of me is to speak my voice.
Yes.
And so,
yes.
you know, I think I'm so grateful that you gave me this opportunity to practice using my voice.
Yeah.
But I think the watershed moment for me around self-care was I was privileged enough to be asked to participate in a vision quest about, it was 2011, I want to say, 2011 or 2012, so quite some time ago. And Vision Quest is a Native American practice and ritual, and it was, people design it in different ways, but essentially what it was is I sat on a mountain with no tent, no food, no water for 4 days. And did I ever tell you about this?
No.
I didn't?
Sounds intense.
I can't
No.
Yeah, people usually say that that does sound intense, and that wasn't really my experience of it. It was it was a very gentle experience, actually. There was a medicine woman who was there leading the ritual. There were others doing it.
Okay.
There was a lot of preparation that went into it, and you know, I had like this little area that was sectioned off with prayer ties filled with tobacco as offering, and you know, I think as a rookie might think like, oh, I'm going to go and do this vision quest and I'll come back enlightened. I'll have this moment of like, aha, I know what the meaning of life is. And, you know, of course it wasn't that. But it was at the same time. I think the two big takeaways I had were really defining for me in terms of the evolution of my self-care practices. And one was that it completely transformed my relationship with food, but turned it upside down, because there's no food for 4 days. And you think like, I need food. And I don't know how to explain it. Just an example is the first few, maybe the whole first 24 hours, I was looking in my backpack. I mean, I had other clothes and I had layers because, you know, it got cold and we could, you know, cover ourselves and to keep ourselves comfortable in that, but there was no food. And
right.
I can't tell you how many times like that almost drove me nuts.
Yeah.
I wasn't hungry. I wasn't. And maybe I got hungry the last day. I was like, okay, my stomach feels like I really need to eat. But you're not doing anything. So
right.
You're not like expending a bunch of energy. You're sitting on a mountain, literally. So you don't need as much intake. But it was just habitual. I realized how deep my habitual like reaching for food, and that is a metaphor for so many other things, like reaching for my phone or reaching for whatever it is, whatever your addictions are, right? And it made me realize, oh yeah, I have addiction to food, sugar in particular. So after that, you know, I didn't have anything, so I reintroduced things, and ever since then I've gone, you know, through different phases of, you know, intermittent fasting.
Yes.
And just trying to be conscious or like eliminating certain things when I know, like my relationship to sugar will never be what it was.
Yeah.
And not to say that I don't indulge in it. I
right.
totally do. I just can see what it does to me, and I can see what my relationship to it and how I like want to dig my nails into like the nearest thing with sugar, and that's, you know, that is a dysfunction.
Yeah.
I mean, you can call it that. Maybe some people don't like that word, but it's like, oh, I see the dark side of my relationship to food.
I think that's totally fair.
Yeah.
That's totally fair.
So that's one thing, and that's why I think, you know, like I'm on this whole, like, farmer's market is my shit.
Yeah.
You know, and I eat local. I try to know the people who grow my food.
Wow.
In order to,
Yeah.
I really realized, like, you know, even going to the Philippines, part of that realization was, oh, in order for me to live, something else has to die.
Mm-hmm.
And just, like, that's profound. You don't think about that. We're not taught to think about that when we go and grab a bag of whatever.
Right.
Right? But in order to sustain us, something else is not sustained. And,
right.
and that there are all these people who, in order to give you the medicine of what real good food is, there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people and things, the earth and plants and animals that are involved in that. So it got really deep.
Yeah.
And it just gets deeper. And
Yeah.
that was like the watershed moment around food. The second piece of it was that it changed my relationship to my cycle and to my my feminine kind of creative center.
Mm.
Because I was on my cycle, or it started the day that I was supposed to go up, right?
Wow. On the vision quest.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it was meant to be, I guess, because you know, I shared that with the people who were taking care of me, and the women were like, okay, so you can go up and continue to do Vision Quest up there on the mountain, or you can do your Vision Quest down here in a yurt and, you know, be comfortable. And I chose to go up, and they said, okay, if you're gonna go up, let's make this prayer tie. And so it was basically these little pouches of tobacco as an offering that I wrapped around my womb as protection
Mm-hmm.
from, like, the elements, the spirits, and the idea, like, just that, oh, I need protection during that time. I need a little bit of extra nurturing and extra care
Mm-hmm.
because of that. I was like, never considered that. And so that was kind of the birthplace of my business idea around, like, women's wellness and the jewelry that I make that is basically like you know, another iteration of those prayer ties that go around the womb, except for I make it with jewelry and, like, gemstones.
Mm-hmm.
And that now, ever since then, like, I really do try to pay attention to that time of the month as a time that I slow down, take better care of myself, eat the things that are supporting me in that.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a ritual, like, that actually that time of my cycle is a sacred time.
Right.
Yeah.
And that you're honoring it, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Feels really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels really good.
Which is really different than, I think, I mean, I don't know personally, but from what I imagine, most girls and women's relationship with their cycle, right?
Yeah.
Like the sense of, like, that it's a drag and that it's awful and that it's that it's something to be shamed.
Yeah.
So it's different to kind of, like, turn it around and really, like, put it in the center rather than a thing that's dragging you down from the side. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. No, I love how my relationship to that has been turned upside down, and it's just made me so appreciative. I mean, it's you know, we don't think about it that often, but it is that inconvenience that makes us capable of giving birth.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
we're
right.
all here because of it.
Real talk.
Yeah.
I got a chance to visit on 2 occasions. Very fortunate to have visited a family that lived on an Apache reservation. This was in the late 90s. And on that first trip, we were introduced. I wish I had known the name, or I probably wouldn't pronounce it correctly. But we were invited to attend a ritual.
Okay.
And it was huge. Like, the whole community came out for it. And it was, if I were to come up with a really bad analogy or comparison, it would be kind of like if you were to think about, like the same kind of celebration that happens around a cotillion or quinceañera or something like this. That would be my poor comparison. But really, it was around a girl's first cycle.
Oh, that's really
Yes,
Apache.
yes. And so we attended, and it was this young girl in regalia, medicine men dancing, and it was like, even though we were in a sense celebrating her, it was like the ritual itself was like an endurance test. So she basically had to dance in regalia for like 4 days.
Wow.
Yeah, and so there was dancing. I mean, obviously there would be breaks, but she would have to dance every time the medicine men got up to do their thing. She would have to join them. And basically on the last day, it was like full on food for the community and just celebration. So it was like her coming of age moment. And it was all not based upon like, you know, an arbitrary age or some other arbitrary event. It was like biological. So that stuck with me forever, this concept of like, there should be celebration around the maturing of your body. And you know, this is kind of a huge moment rather than to have girls be embarrassed about it. To say like, hey, like, let's honor this as like a spiritual, physical, everything moment, you know? So it reminded me of that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, our communities, like all people of color, we've got the answers.
Yeah.
But
we've got them, right?
Yeah.
We've got them, it's there.
They're there,
Yeah.
and they are so, like, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
That's the way it's supposed to be.
Totally.
I'm all about rituals and coming of age, and I really want to re-embrace and even come up with new ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, just redefine what that can be.
Yeah, it's in there.
Yeah.
It's in there, totally. Let's talk about rituals. Let's talk about, you mentioned, you know, that the cycle is responsible for why we're all here. Like it's part of that magic, right? What has been your experience like? You know, we've talked about your other jobs, but one of your main jobs.
Yes, my primary job.
Your primary job is that of mother, right?
Yeah.
So what's it been like juggling all these different things and that? Or is it not a juggle? Like, is it integrated, or like, how do you? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You know what I mean?
No, you're not putting. It's a juggle. I'm working with Janet Coe, who's an acupuncturist, and she's doing coaching work too. And she called it like being on a hamster wheel, because it's hardest job of my life and the most fulfilling by far. Yeah. Like, this motherhood shit is no joke.
Yeah.
It is like tears you down completely, and also just gives meaning and life. It's so many different things. It is, you know, I am a single mother, but one of the things that has struck me in the specific experience of single motherhood that I've had, it's not even actually just one experience, it's two experiences. So one was single motherhood out of divorce, which is very different from other like there's a spectrum of experiences in single motherhood. Right. And you know, both fathers are really involved. One is my ex-husband, and so I have a co-parent who's local, and now we're like 40 minutes apart, but at one point we were like 15 minutes apart, like 15-minute walk from it. And that's very different from my second child, whose father lives in LA, so most of the child-rearing responsibilities fall on me. And to be honest, I think that for a good amount of time, I really felt victim within this experience that I really had chosen. I wanted to have that child. I loved being a mom. I loved being pregnant. I loved giving birth, the whole thing. Now that I'm officially in my late 40s, I'm like, damn, I should have done it more. Like, I should have thought about this earlier and figured out how I could have more. But yeah, I think motherhood is one of the hardest things, the heaviest burdens to carry, and I don't I think it's easy to go into victim mode, but it also is something that really grounds me, even in my work, because I think about what kind of world do I want to co-design for my children, and they're also really far apart in age. So one is 16, going on 17, the other one is 5, and they're completely different worlds. Yeah. So you know, there are lots of moms out there, but like this teenager, 16 was a challenge. Yeah. You know, you think like infanthood is the hardest period, and it was really hard. especially doing it by myself for the most part with the younger one. Like when somebody has to pick him up from school, I don't have family around, right? So it's got to be me, and I'm trying to juggle and figure out, okay, I've got to be accountable to the people I work with, and I've got to be accountable to my grantees, I've got to be accountable to my students, and sometimes I have to say, sorry y'all, I got to go pick up my kid who is having an asthma attack right now, and there's nobody else to pick him up. Right. So that young time can be really scary, and it's can be really hard. 5 to 10 was a breeze. He sort of was learning how to do things on his own. They're still really cute. They still really love being around you. For when I would go and pick him up, his whole face would light up. And then 16 or teenagerhood comes around, and that all starts to change. And they start becoming their own person. And I have found that therapy has been really particularly helpful in parenting a teenager, because if you don't have your issues sorted out, and you don't know what they are, they're all going to come back and bite you in the ass when you're parenting a teenager.
I believe it.
Because they're becoming their own person, and I can see all the things that I don't want him to make that mistake. I don't want you to make that mistake, and then also it's like this push and pull of he still needs my protection, but he's got to learn how to be his own person. And I have to allow him to do that, but I don't want him to kill himself because his brain isn't fully developed yet. So it is definitely a juggling act, and this time more than any, as a teenager, is I have no idea what, is this the right way to do it? Should I lean in a little bit more, or maybe I have no idea. When they're 1 to 5, it's kind of obvious. It's very primal, what their needs are. Now I'm I have no idea. I read a lot of books. I've read the most parenting books since he became a teenager than ever before.
That's so interesting. That's interesting.
Is it?
It reminds me of that hierarchy, right? So it's physical needs at the bottom, and then more cerebral, spiritual at the top. And I feel what you're describing, that in the beginning, it's the roadmap is maybe more clear, right? Because you're it's clear what the physical needs are, and then as the child gets older, I can see how that would be more difficult, because it's more difficult in us in general as adults, because we are on that same roadmap from hopefully meeting most of our physical needs to eventually learning, asking the bigger questions. Who am I? What's my purpose? Why am I here? How do I make peace with myself, with the future, with the past, right? And then to have that in tandem with someone you're raising is interesting. I can see how that could be a challenge.
It is a challenge.
And informative, right? Sometimes kids are powerful teachers.
It was the best teachers. And my kids are my most powerful teachers for sure, and one of the most beautiful teachings I've received from them is really about my own parents. And I had, as many people do, have had really challenging experiences with their mother in particular, I'll say. And now I'm just oh man, I'm sorry. I see what all these things that I thought she was crazy, and she was doing all these, and I get it now. I get it on such and another thing about transforming culture, I think our culture is really, we don't treat our moms right. Even in therapy sometimes, you describe a trauma that you had as a kid, and therapists will want to blame your mom, or I know people who were don't talk to their parents, and I could see how that might have been a route, I think it's really misguided, and that has been one of the best teachings of being a parent, particularly of a teenager, is to really be able to see the humanity of my mom.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
It's a tribute.
Yeah.
The moment itself, right?
Yeah, I wish I could have seen it sooner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's life.
I guess so.
That's life. There's a timing to it. There's almost like a poetry to it.
I'm just glad she's still around.
Yeah.
So that I can kind of, try and just engage in that differently than I did when I was 16.
Good for you.
Or even 26.
Yeah.
Or 36.
It takes a while. Some lessons take a while.
Yeah.
Do you hate when people call you a super mom, or is that a compliment? Because it feels like it's very common naming for women who do everything. But I also find it's like, I imagine it could also be like a big burden. Like, why can't I just be a human and not a super mom? Like, you know what I mean?
I
like,
can see that.
What's the balance for you? Like, are you like,
I'm a beast. I'll take it.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so here's a question. When you think about like a typical image of a mom, where do you figure into that landscape? And what do you feel like, how do you feel like you identify and not identify with that typical image of a mom, of a single mom? I mean, everyone's circumstance, as you described, is really unique. So what part of that do you feel like, oh yeah, I relate to that, but there's another part of it where I feel like I'm not as represented?
Not into the mom jeans. I don't know why that comes up.
Jeans?
Mom jeans. Have you
Like
heard that
high-waisted?
term? I guess there's a thing called mom jeans, and maybe that's
I think
old.
of the 80s.
Yeah, maybe
when
it's
someone
old.
says mom jeans.
So maybe I'm dating myself. I do think I'm
Millennials are wearing mom jeans now.
I know. I still haven't been able to bring myself to that. I do have some high-waisted other kinds of pants, like culottes and stuff, but not the jeans.
Yeah, but they're trying to be ironic, maybe. And like, if an older person does it, it might not be ironic. It might be like, hey, you've been wearing that since the 80s.
So maybe mom jeans isn't a thing. I do think of myself as somewhat unconventional. I made the choice to be a single mom for the second time, but the thing is, I think of it as unconventional. I don't think it's that unconventional anymore. I think there are a lot more women making all kinds of non-traditional choices around motherhood, and I think it's dope. So I don't think there's really anything out there that particularly strikes me as like a mom stereotype that doesn't fit for me. I do think like maybe there's this tendency to think of moms as kind of like putting themselves aside to focus on their children. If anything, like maybe that. Yeah. Right.
That you relate to or not relate to?
Do not relate to. Like, I am all about my kids, and yet I think in order to be all about my kids, I have to put myself in the center.
I agree.
Yeah, like kind of like the mask on first. Like
that's right.
The airplane. I used to think that was fucked up when I was a kid. I was like, what do you mean? You have to take care
because you're the kid. You would think that.
Like, how are you not going to take care of the other? And then I was like, oh, now as I'm a mother, I'm like, oh, I get it. If I can't take care of myself, like really, really fully, and the more I can inhabit my own power and strength, then the more I'll be able to give that back to my kids, community, grantees, students, everybody, right? So the more fortified I am in myself, then the more I can give back.
I agree.
So that maybe that stereotype, and then also like the fashion thing. Fashion is a thing for me. Like people either love or hate my style choices, and I realize like there's sometimes I will take meetings with people and I wear like kind of crazy shit for government. People. So I'm wearing the hat. I'm in the office, but I'm wearing this hat, and I think that's part of my way of like disrupting the matrix. People think of government as like
square,
and moms as becoming more and more square as they get. I think I get more eccentric, and I make like bolder choices in some ways. I try not to make reckless choices. Right. But
there's a difference.
Yeah. But with fashion, I definitely think like that's kind of my way of disrupting the matrix sometimes, and I don't wear like the blue and gray and black suits. Like somebody came in to meet, it was Dory, she came in, she's like, you don't seem like you work in government. And I was like, I get that from time to time, and I think I realize that's deliberate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, we all got to find our expression, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I remember when I first, oops, let me close this. When I first started in business coaching, I tried to fit what I thought a business coach was supposed to look like. And it was, I didn't go all out, but I definitely made a bunch of wardrobe changes that in hindsight were kind of silly.
Because you were trying to like fit the part.
Fit the part,
Yeah.
right? But I think we all, maybe that's something I had to go through to realize how silly it was.
Yeah.
To realize that like I'm powerful, maybe even more so when I'm just myself.
Yourself.
Right? And I get it. I mean, I'll dress nice for a meeting, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? But it doesn't mean I have to look like somebody else. I'll
Yeah.
dress my version of nice, you know? And so, yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I get that.
I think I've always made crazy style choices. Like my first week at work here, I came in to work with braids, like some really, really tight braids on the side of my head. And I think it was because I had a performance coming up that weekend. I was like with the salsa troupe at that time. And the director who had hired me, like, he saw me come into work and he was like, he didn't tell me that day. He told me like when we had known each other for a couple of years, and he was like, okay. But he told me that he definitely like was like, oh, she came in here with braids, all right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a new world.
Yeah.
Claudine's in town. Right on.
It's not just me. I mean, there's plenty of people who like I think push it in different ways now. Yeah.
I imagine that's also very San Francisco.
I think so.
Right.
Yeah, I think so.
Casual work environments, opposed to say like New York. I haven't lived there in a long time, but I mean, you know, New York, you get the sense that everyone really has a lot of black and
3-piece suits
right.
in government.
And exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, there's something beautiful about it too, and time and place.
There can be.
There
can be. It's not for me though.
Yeah, in general, it's not for me, but
Yeah.
there's sometimes when I like to, you know, just switch it up and go, like, wear the pearls and
surprise people.
Yeah.
Let's see. A couple more things. Long time ago when we were trading sort of like business development, personal development tips, one of the things that you told me struck you in some of the literature I was encouraging you to read was this, the sentence, how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Oh my God.
What is
if
that?
my kid ever watches this, he's going to be like, oh, I have Anthem to thank.
It's that guy's fault. What does that mean to you?
Oh, it's everywhere. Okay. God. What examples do I actually feel comfortable sharing? So many different ones. I mean, I guess.
Well,
like,
if you had to explain it quickly to somebody who'd never heard of that phrasing, how you do one thing is how you do everything. How would you explain that as a concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, and I'll be like a little vulnerable here. So if you were to come to my desk right now and see the state that it's in, it's a bit cluttered. You know, it's not like there are things that are not in their right place.
Yeah.
They're not filed away.
Yeah.
I can get things done. I can still be productive. You know, so it's not like a complete disaster. I mean, there's no food, you know, rotting food or anything like that. But there is some disarray, and if you were to come to my house, you would see the same thing, right? And you would, so wherever, like if, I think it's an indication of, for me, it's where I kind of beat up on myself, like I need to practice a little bit.
Sorry.
That's okay. So discipline in terms of like spatially putting things in their right place, that's just like a physical kind of thing, but also sometimes emotionally and like relationships and like let's say I have a bad day or I made a bad decision with, or if I made like a decision that, you know, I come home and it impacts like how I interact with my kids, right? And like I have a a temper tantrum with one of my kids, and so like, yeah, that's, you can see on my desk there's things that are not put in the right place, but also emotionally I sometimes don't put things in their right place.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really goes across so many different dimensions
I
of
agree.
your life. So there's certain things that I try to really practice, and I'm hoping that with, it's an iteration. So like, I make my bed every day,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one thing that as a ritual, like I do it every day without fail, and I build upon that. This is again part of the self-care. Every day I wake up and I do yoga. Sometimes I can do a half an hour yoga practice. Sometimes I can even do 45 minutes on the weekends.
Right.
But sometimes I can only do like 3 poses, or maybe even just a pose. But
Right.
because the belief is how I do one thing is how I do everything, I have to hold on to at least some element of like routine, and so that I can carry that with me through the day.
Yeah.
And I have found that if I'm able to have that consistent routine and I
Right.
build on that,
Right.
then that energy comes with me throughout the day. It's how, like, at least there's some a little bit more order to my day. There's
Mhm.
a little bit more spaciousness, because I created that spaciousness in my morning. Even if I had to rush out and I have to make lunch for my kids or whatever, but I created that spaciousness and quiet for myself in that morning. That spaciousness and quiet, I can hold that with me for the rest of the day. Again, how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. For me, it's like this sense of like showing up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because I feel like, how do we practice successes where it might count most?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's in the little things. And I experienced that several weeks ago. I injured my leg in jiu-jitsu, and that same week I signed up for like a local tournament,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I had every excuse not to show up.
Okay.
It was one of those things. I'm like, my leg hurts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna lose.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I just stay home.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things, like, to me, like, it started to become more of like a symbolic win or loss.
Totally.
And I was like, well, if I'm healthy enough, if I
Mhm.
meet the minimum standard for healthy to get on the mat, I should
Mhm.
get on the mat
Mm-hmm.
and face the loss like an adult.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And give it my all, and maybe I'll be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll be surprised, and maybe I'll still win.
Mm-hmm.
But make peace with the fact that, like, probably I won't.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean I shouldn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
And you do show up.
Yeah, and I felt like that was like a
Mhm.
big thing, because I felt like if I gave myself an out, my biggest concern was that would make it easier for myself to have an out at other points in my life
That's right.
where something mattered or counted.
Mm-hmm.
To say, oh, well, I don't have to, I have every reason not to, and then that becomes a habit,
Totally.
and I don't want to get into that habit, as for myself, but also for anyone who might be watching me.
Mhm.
Not that anyone's watching me, or you know what I mean, but like I
You're
have
watching
to.
you.
I'm watching me, and
Yeah.
I hold myself to some standard, so that when someone does work with me, personally or professionally or whatever, that they know, like, hey, this guy's really all about it, to that degree, right? This concept of showing up.
Yeah.
What are other sayings that you might like, or words
That's
of?
a really good articulation of that one. Yeah, just like the showing up and showing up for yourself
Mhm.
and being consistent in that. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that has been my habit at different parts of my life.
Mhm.
Right, is not showing up, and like when there's a reason to not show up, then
Right.
I'll
'Cause there's a logic.
give myself the out.
Right.
But then it does, it translates, it becomes a habit. So yeah, what was the thing I was thinking about as you were talking? It's practice.
Yeah.
It's practice.
Right. Practice showing up
Mm-hmm.
and not showing up.
Mm-hmm.
They're both types of practice.
are.
And no matter what, you're always in practice,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Other sayings.
Yeah, other sayings that you might want to share. Related, I mean, as of recent, maybe something more fresh, because that's something we talked about a while ago. What's come up for you recently where you're like, hey, that's it doesn't have to be a saying, but some wisdom that you might want to impart.
I think just it talks about, I guess it's related to self-care and trauma. Gabor Mate is a guy that I listen to and as it relates to trauma and addiction, and I believe that we all have different addictions, and even these addicted to different types of habits, right? And it's not so much a saying, but an idea that my friend has been talking about, Tasi's been talking about, coming back to herself. And Gabor Mate talks about trauma as a separation from yourself, right? And even just kind of coming full circle and to the story about, when I was a kid and wanted to be something that I wasn't, right? And I think that what I realize about coming back to yourself and rediscovering yourself is so deep, is that I realize like everybody's beautiful. We're all born beautiful. We're all born powerful. And I think there is a journey that you have to go through, and it's painful at times of inhabiting that beauty and power fully, and realizing that power and beauty. Because I think so many of us, because of the matrix and because of colonization, we are separated from our own beauty and our power and our strength and who we are, and not just us, but even all the people who came before us, who are still us.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that has been really resonating for me, and that informs my practice as well. Like the mindfulness is really just, how can I just be with myself instead of like out here in that thing,
Yes.
or, yeah.
Yeah. Powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so simple.
Yeah. How about you? What's a recent one for you? You always have good ones.
Oh man, I don't know. I think I think for me, I think it goes back down to that mindfulness practice. I don't know if there's a particular saying, but I think I'm just trying to embrace this concept of being inside of the empty space. I think for a lot of my life, I always believed I could think my way through things because I wanted to celebrate that I was smart. And so that's life. That's life. But this idea of like I'm smart, so I can figure things out. And so I think there's like a broader intelligence, more creative, that comes from stillness, that you can't tap into with your cerebral self. And so I think that for me has been a practice as of recent. Like, again, going back to that stillness practice and being like, hey, like, this is okay too. Even in forcefully doing nothing, I still am me. I still have value. I'm still of worth. And I don't have to be doing things to feel like I'm important, and something as simple as that, just like, I'm just gonna chill for a little bit and be okay with that, and enjoying that ebb and flow.
I can totally relate to that one for sure. Like I think that as I get older, I'm realizing, I think I have this belief that to be successful, I have to have grit and like.
I mean, that's part of it.
Clenched,
but Yeah, but it's not everything.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that though. I think that it's like the yin and yang kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like like mindfulness, stillness, and then also a combination of that and the showing up that you just talked about.
Yeah.
Like we do have to participate.
That's right.
In our lives and in what we are here to do.
100%. I just feel like there is a time not to participate, especially at the end of our lives.
Yeah.
There will be no participation at all.
Yeah.
Because it will be all over. So I think while we're here, like, let's do what we can to make a contribution. And sometimes our contributions are going to be major and people will applaud us for it. And sometimes they're just going to be really minor and almost invisible, but it still counts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So participate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe in that fully, majorly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good stuff. Thank you,
Really
Claudine.
good stuff. Thank you, Anthem. That was really fun.
Yeah, we'll do it again.
Yeah.
Appreciate it a lot.
Oh, likewise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Facebook world.